"You will come with me," the lonely herder said to the Navajo woman fleeing the land grabbers. Anahi's heart raced as she hurried through the dusty desert. The sun had already begun its descent behind the distant hills, casting long shadows across the rugged land. Her mind was filled with fear and uncertainty. She had heard the rumors, seen the signs. Land grabbers were on the move. The land she and her family had lived on for generations was no longer safe. The land grabbers, greedy and ruthless, had already taken several neighboring plots of land, forcing families to flee. Anahi had hoped it wouldn't come to this, but now there was no choice. She had to leave. Her hands shook as she tightened the bundle of belongings she had managed to pack. A few clothes, a blanket, and the small pouch of herbs her grandmother had passed down to her. These things were all she had left from the life she knew. Everything else, the home, the land, the memories, would be lost to the land grabbers. As she walked through the vast, empty desert, Anahi's mind wandered to the past. She remembered the laughter of her family around the fire, the stories told by her father under the stars. Those days felt so far away now, replaced by the harsh reality of survival. The wind howled through the cracks of the land, carrying dust that stung her skin and blurred her vision. It was as though the very earth was mourning the loss of all it had once held. She had no idea where she was going. All she knew was that she had to keep moving. The land grabbers wouldn't stop until they had everything. They didn't care who they hurt, as long as they got what they wanted. Her family had tried to fight, but they were outnumbered, outmatched, and too few to defend their land. Anahi's father had told her to run when he saw how close the land grabbers were. "Go, Anahi! Run as far as you can," he had said. "You have a chance to survive. Don't let it slip away." And so she ran. But where to? The desert offered no refuge, no shelter from the danger that followed her every step. She could hear the echoes of footsteps in her mind, the sound of men shouting, searching for her. She had to stay ahead, stay hidden. She had no choice but to rely on the land she knew, the land that had given her everything, even though it now seemed like a stranger. Hours passed, and Anahi's legs grew tired. Her feet burned from walking on the hot sand, and her throat was dry, aching for water. She could feel the weight of exhaustion pulling at her, but she couldn't stop. Not yet. There was still too much ground to cover, too many miles between her and safety. As the sun sank lower in the sky, a shadow appeared on the horizon. At first, Anahi thought it was just another mirage, a trick of the light. But as the shape grew clearer, she saw that it was a man. A lone figure standing still against the backdrop of the setting sun. Anahi's instinct screamed at her to run, to hide, but she was too tired. She didn't know if she had the strength left to move. The man wasn't far away now, and she could see that he was watching her. Anahi stopped, standing still in the middle of the desert, unsure of what to do. The man had seen her, and there was nowhere to hide. Bah! She could turn and run, but her legs felt as if they were made of stone, and she knew the man would easily catch up with her. She could face him, try to explain who she was, and hope for the best, but what if he was one of the land grabbers? What if he was the one sent to track her down? The man approached slowly, and as he got closer, Anahi could see the worn clothes he wore, the dust covering his face and hands. He looked like a man who had been alone for a long time, someone who had seen hardship but was still standing. His face was weathered, his eyes dark, but there was something about him, something that made Anahi feel a flicker of hope. He stopped a few feet from her and spoke, his voice calm and steady. "Are you lost?" I'm not lost," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. I'm just trying to get away." The man studied her for a moment, his gaze softening. "From what?" he asked. Anahi hesitated. She didn't know if she could trust him. The world had become a place where trust was a dangerous thing to give. But something in the man's eyes made her believe that he wasn't a threat. That, perhaps, he understood. "The land grabbers," she said at last, her voice barely audible. "They're coming for my family's land. They've already taken others. They'll take ours next. The man's expression darkened and he nodded. That's no small thing to escape from, but it's clear that you've made it this far on your own. That's something. Anahi's heart skipped a beat. No one had ever said anything like that to her. Everyone else had only seen her as a victim, someone to pity. But this man, this stranger, saw strength in her.
I don't know where I'm going, she admitted, her voice shaking. I don't know what to do.
You don't have to go alone, he said, his voice gentle but firm. You can come with me. I'll help you. You don't have to face this by yourself. Anahi's mind spun. Could she trust him? Could she really go with this stranger? Her family had always told her to trust no one, to rely only on her own strength. But here she was, at the edge of everything she had ever known, alone in the desert with no clear path ahead. The thought of continuing on alone was terrifying. You will come with me, the man said again, his words carrying a sense of calm authority. I'm not asking. I'm telling you, you can't make it out here alone. But you can make it with me. Anahi looked at him, her heart heavy with the weight of everything she had lost. She had always been strong, but now she saw that strength wasn't just about surviving on your own. Sometimes, strength came from allowing someone else to help. She nodded slowly, her voice almost a whisper. Okay, I'll go with you. The man smiled, and for the first time since everything had started to fall apart, Anahi felt a flicker of hope. But perhaps this was the chance she needed. Perhaps there was still something worth fighting for. And with that, they began to walk together. Two strangers, bound by the same desire for survival in a world that had taken so much. The journey ahead was uncertain, the danger still very real, but for the first time in a long while, Anahi didn't feel so alone. The days that followed were hard, but for the first time in what felt like ages, Anahi felt a sense of safety. The man whom she had come to know as Jared led her through the desert without haste, guiding her away from the dangers she feared. He seemed to know the land well, and the steady pace he set was both reassuring and calming. Anahi had spent her life in the harsh conditions of the desert, but she had never been this far away from her home. The unfamiliar landscape seemed endless, and the wide open spaces filled her with both awe and unease. At first, she was reluctant to speak much. Her heart was heavy with grief and loss. The memories of her family, the laughter of her brothers and sisters, the smell of her mother's cooking, all seemed so distant now. Each step she took with Jared felt like moving further away from the life she had known, and she wasn't sure if she was ready to let go. But as the days passed, the silence between them grew more comfortable. Jared never pressured her to speak, but when she did open up, his responses were kind, thoughtful, and without judgment. One morning, after they had walked for hours under the scorching sun, they stopped beside a small oasis. Jared had spotted it from a distance, a cluster of palm trees standing tall against the flat desert. It was a rare sight in the vast emptiness they had been crossing, and it offered the relief they both desperately needed. Anahi sat down on the cool ground, grateful for the shade, and let out a sigh of relief. She had long since run out of water, and the dryness in her throat had made it difficult to focus. Jared handed her a small water flask, which she took eagerly. As she drank, Jared unpacked some simple food, dried meat, flatbread, and a small bag of nuts. The taste of the food was plain, but to Anahi it was like a gift. For the first time in days, she felt a sense of peace settle in her chest. "Thank you," she said quietly, looking up at Jared. He nodded. "No need to thank me. I should be the one thanking you for letting me help." The words were simple, but they struck Anahi deeply. In a world where she had been forced to flee and trust no one, Jared's kindness was a rare treasure. It felt strange to accept help from someone else, but at the same time she realized how much it meant to her. For so long she had been carrying the weight of her fears alone, and now she was sharing that burden with someone who seemed to care even though they were strangers to one another. They sat together for a while, enjoying the moment of quiet. But as the sun began to set, Jared's expression changed. There was a certain seriousness in his eyes that Anahi couldn't ignore.
"We need to keep moving," Jared said softly. "The land grabbers are still looking for you. We can't stay in one place too long."
Anahi nodded, her heart sinking a little at the reminder. The feeling of safety she had briefly felt was fleeting, but she understood the truth in his words.
They couldn't risk being found.
The land grabbers had shown no mercy to others, and she knew they wouldn't hesitate to hurt anyone who got in their way. With a quick glance at the small oasis, they gathered their things and set off once more. The journey continued, and despite the exhaustion that weighed on Anani's body, she found herself growing more accustomed to the rhythm of walking with Jared. They didn't talk much, but there was a quiet companionship between them that she hadn't expected. Jared had been alone for so long that it seemed natural for him to keep his distance emotionally, but he was never cold. In fact, there were times when Anahi felt as if she could talk to him about anything, though she still held back. As the days passed, they came across more small desert towns, and Anahi saw for the first time how Jared interacted with others. He was respected, but also somewhat of a mystery. People would nod or wave as they passed, but no one stayed long enough to exchange more than a few words. Anahi realized that Jared had been living a solitary life for years, and she couldn't help but wonder what had brought him to such a remote place.
It wasn't until one evening as they made camp that she finally decided to ask, "Jared," she began, her voice soft, "why do you live out here, so far from everyone?" Jared looked at her for a moment, as if deciding how much to say.
The fire crackled between them, and the distant stars blinked in the night sky. For a moment it seemed like he wouldn't answer. But then he sighed and spoke in a quiet, reflective tone.
"I had a family once,"
he said, his voice distant.
"A wife, a son. We lived in a small cabin not far from here. But life doesn't always go as planned. I lost them both in an accident. Since then, I've been alone." Anai felt a pang of sympathy for him.
She couldn't imagine the kind of pain he must have gone through. Losing everything the way he had was a sorrow she understood too well. "I'm sorry," she whispered, feeling the weight of his loss.
"I had a family too, before the land grabbers came. Now I don't know where they are or what's left of our land."
Jared's gaze softened, and he nodded.
"It's not easy, losing everything, but that's why we keep going. We can't stop. We can't let the past hold us back, no matter how much it hurts. The world keeps moving whether we like it or not." She didn't know what the future held, but in that moment she understood what Jared meant. The world was harsh, unforgiving, but it didn't stop.
And neither could she. The next morning they resumed their journey, and over the following days, Anahi found herself growing stronger. The physical hardships of the desert, the long hours of walking, had begun to feel less daunting. She still missed her family, but Jared had become her ally, someone she could count on in a world that had taken so much. She had never imagined she would find herself here, in the middle of the desert with a stranger who had lost so much just like her. But in his quiet presence, she felt a sense of hope, fragile, but real. By the time they reached the next town, Anahi was beginning to feel a flicker of something she hadn't experienced in weeks. Peace. Though their journey was far from over, she realized that she wasn't alone anymore. Jared had become her protector, and in turn she had become something he hadn't had for a long time, a companion. They may have been running from the same dangers, but together they were no longer just survivors. They were partners in the fight for something better, something worth living for. Days turned into weeks as Anahi and Jared traveled through the harsh desert landscape. The journey was difficult, but the companionship they had found in each other made it more bearable. They moved by day, resting at night under the stars, and as time passed, Anahi's trust in Jared grew. She had been alone for so long, but now there was someone who cared enough to help her. She could see it in his actions and the way he looked out for her. And though he was often quiet, Anahi knew he, too, carried his own burdens.
It wasn't just the desert that tested them. The constant fear of being found by the land grabbers was a weight that never left. Every day, Jared would stop and scan the horizon, his sharp eyes ever watchful.
Though they had managed to stay ahead of the danger so far, neither of them could relax. They both knew the moment they let their guard down could be the moment it was too late. One afternoon, as they walked through a stretch of dry plains, Anahi felt a shiver of unease run through her. They had been in this area for a couple of days, and although there were no signs of the land grabbers, something felt wrong. Jared had stopped in his tracks, his face tense as he studied the land around them. "What's wrong?" Anahi asked, her voice quiet but filled with concern. Jared didn't answer immediately. He crouched down, his fingers tracing the ground. "Tracks," he muttered under his breath.
"Fresh ones! Someone's been here recently."
Anahi's stomach dropped. They had been careful to avoid any signs of their passage, but now it seemed their luck had run out. She glanced nervously over her shoulder, as if expecting to see the land grabbers emerging from the dust.
"We need to move,"
Jared said, standing up quickly.
"Now!"
Without another word, they began to pick up their pace. Jared led the way, his eyes scanning the terrain ahead, while Anahi tried to match his speed. Her heart pounded in her chest, and for the first time in a while, fear began to rise in her throat. They had managed to stay ahead of their pursuers, but now it seemed like the land grabbers were closing in. As the hours passed, Anahi's legs grew tired, and the weight of their situation pressed down on her. It felt like they had been walking forever, but the fear of being caught kept them moving.
Jared didn't stop to rest. He only paused to check their surroundings, always cautious, always aware.
The harsh desert sun beat down on them, but still they pushed forward. They couldn't afford to stop. Eventually, the landscape changed. The wide-open plains gave way to rocky hills and jagged cliffs. It was a welcome change from the endless stretch of flat, barren land, but it also brought its own challenges. The rocky terrain made walking even more difficult, and Anahi could feel the strain in her muscles. But it wasn't the physical exhaustion that was weighing on her now. It was the uncertainty. They didn't know how far the land grabbers had followed them, or if they were even still being pursued. But every step forward felt like a gamble.
"Do you think they're still after us?"
Anahi asked, her voice barely above a whisper as they walked through the narrow canyon. Jared didn't answer immediately. He paused, his eyes scanning the distant hills.
"I don't know,"
he said after a moment.
"But we can't afford to wait around to find out."
The tension between them was palpable, but it was clear that Jared was trying to stay focused. Anahi admired his resolve, but she couldn't help feeling a pang of doubt. How long could they keep running? How long could they stay ahead of people who were determined to take everything from her? They made their way through the canyon, moving quickly but carefully, trying not to make too much noise. Anahi's mind raced with thoughts of her family, of her home, the place she had grown up. She wondered if it was still standing, if anyone had survived the land grabbers' attack. She wished she had known sooner, had acted sooner, but there was no changing the past. All she could do now was keep moving forward. As the sun began to set, they reached a small, sheltered area within the canyon, hidden from view. Jared signaled for them to stop, and they both sank to the ground, exhausted. The shadows grew longer, and the temperature dropped, but the sense of danger didn't fade. Jared sat silently, his back against the rocky wall, watching the entrance to the canyon. Anahi leaned back against the stone, trying to catch her breath. The journey had taken a toll on her body, but it was the emotional strain that had been the hardest to bear. For so long she had carried the weight of the world on her shoulders, and now it felt like everything was slipping through her fingers. The thought of losing everything again, of having to run again, was unbearable. But she knew that running was their only option.
"You're quiet,"
Jared said suddenly, breaking the silence.
Anahi looked over at him, surprised.
"What do you mean?" "You've been quiet for a while now," he said, his voice softer than usual. "What's on your mind?" Anahi hesitated, unsure if she wanted to share her fears. She had been holding them in for so long, but maybe it was time to let them out. "I don't know how much longer I can do this," she admitted, her voice shaky.
"I don't know how much longer I can keep running."
Jared studied her for a moment, his expression unreadable. "I get it," he said quietly.
"But running is all we can do right now. We don't have a choice."
Anahi nodded, feeling the weight of his words. She knew he was right, but that didn't make it any easier. They had been running for so long, but the fear was always there, just beneath the surface. The land grabbers were relentless, and there was no telling how much longer they could stay ahead of them. "I'm scared," Anahi whispered, more to herself than to Jared. For the first time since they had met, Jared seemed to soften. He moved closer to her, his voice low and reassuring.
It's okay to be scared!
But you don't have to be alone in it. His words struck her deeply, and for the first time in a long time, Anahi felt the tears well up in her eyes. She hadn't allowed herself to cry, not since the day she had left her home, but in that moment she couldn't hold it back any longer. The pain of everything she had lost, the fear of what was to come, all of it came rushing to the surface. Jared didn't say anything more, but he didn't need to. He simply sat beside her, his presence comforting in a way she couldn't explain. They didn't talk for a while, but there was a quiet understanding between them now. They were both running from their pasts, but they didn't have to face the future alone. As the night grew darker, Anani wiped her tears and took a deep breath. The road ahead was uncertain, and the danger was still very real. But for the first time in a long time, she felt like maybe, just maybe, there was hope. They weren't just running anymore. They were fighting. Together. The days continued to pass, and though the sun's heat still threatened to wear them down, something had shifted between Anahi and Jared. The connection they shared had deepened, not just through the shared hardship of the desert journey, but in the small moments of understanding that passed between them. They didn't speak much, but their companionship had become an anchor. There were moments when Jared would glance at her, and she could sense his concern, his quiet presence a reminder that they weren't entirely alone. As they moved deeper into the mountains, the terrain grew more difficult. The rocky paths became steeper, and the sparse vegetation in the area provided little shelter from the harsh elements. Anahi's feet ached from the endless walking, and her body felt the weight of each passing day. But there was something about the mountains that made her feel both awestruck and small. They had always been there, towering over the land, watching over everything. In some strange way, they felt like a constant, reminding her that the world was much bigger than the troubles she had faced. Jared, who had grown accustomed to these mountains, was always a step ahead. His knowledge of the land allowed him to find small streams and sheltered caves where they could rest for the night. He was a man of few words, but Anahi had come to appreciate his calm demeanor. It was like he carried the weight of the world silently, and in his silence he gave her the space to do the same. One afternoon, as they reached a narrow valley, Anahi felt a sense of unease creeping into her chest. She couldn't place it, but something was different about the place. The air felt thicker, heavier, and the familiar feeling of being hunted, of being watched, began to settle over her like a shadow. She instinctively looked around, her eyes scanning the rocky ridges and the small outcrops of trees, but saw nothing unusual. "Jared," she whispered, her voice low with worry. "I feel like we're being followed." Jared didn't respond immediately, but she saw his body stiffen at the mention of it. He paused, glancing around them with a practiced eye. After a long moment, he spoke. "I've been feeling it too," he admitted, his voice calm but tinged with something Anahi couldn't quite place.
Stay close to me. We don't know who's out there, but we need to be ready. She had known that they couldn't outrun the land grabbers forever, but now the danger felt so much closer, as if it were breathing down their necks. They had been careful, always keeping to less traveled paths, always watching the horizon for any signs of trouble.
But this time, it felt like the land was betraying them, the quiet whisper of the wind carrying threats that they couldn't ignore. They continued to move forward cautiously, sticking to the shadows and avoiding open spaces. The valley they had entered was narrow, bordered by high cliffs on either side, and it seemed like the perfect place to be ambushed. Every rustling sound, every shift in the wind made Anahi's heart leap in her chest. She couldn't help but glance over her shoulder every few moments, her instincts screaming that someone was close. As they reached the far end of the valley, Jared stopped and signaled for Anahi to follow him into a small cave that was hidden beneath a rock overhang. The entrance was narrow, but it was just big enough for them to squeeze inside. They crouched down in the darkness, their breathing heavy as they tried to remain silent.
"I'm going to check the area," Jared whispered after a while. "Stay here and stay quiet. Don't make a sound."
She had never been this afraid. The thought of facing the land grabbers again, of losing everything, made her heart ache with fear. But Jared's calm presence was the one thing that kept her grounded. She trusted him, and she knew that he wouldn't let anything happen to her. Minutes turned into hours, and still, there was no sign of Jared. Anahi was beginning to feel the weight of the silence pressing in on her, the darkness of the cave growing heavier with each passing moment. Her eyes adjusted to the dim light, and she found herself lost in her thoughts. She thought about her family, about the home she had lost, and about the life she had been forced to leave behind.
What would her family think of her now, running across the desert with a stranger constantly on the move? Would they have done the same?
Or would they have fought, stood their ground until the end? She was pulled from her thoughts by a sudden sound, a soft rustle, almost imperceptible but enough to make her heart race. She quickly glanced toward the entrance of the cave, but there was nothing there. The air felt thick with tension, and Anahi's breath hitched in her chest.
Was it Jared? Or had they finally been found?
A shadow moved past the entrance of the cave, and Anahi froze, holding her breath. She didn't know whether to call out or stay silent. A moment later, she heard a familiar voice. "It's just me." Anahi let out a sigh of relief as Jared stepped into the cave, his face tired but unharmed. He had been gone for what felt like forever, and the tension that had built up in her chest began to release.
"We've been followed," Jared said quietly. "But I lost them. They won't find us here."
Anani nodded, her hands trembling slightly.
"Are you sure? What if they come back?" "They won't,"
Jared assured her.
"I made sure of it. We need to keep moving, but we'll need to stay alert. This place is too exposed."
They didn't speak for the rest of the night, but Anahi could feel the change in the air.
The calm that had settled over them earlier was gone, replaced by the sharp edge of caution. They knew that the land grabbers were getting closer, and the thought of being hunted again, of losing everything she had left, gnawed at her.
But Jared's steady presence beside her made her feel like they could face whatever was to come. They weren't alone. The next morning they packed up quickly, their movements swift and practiced. As they left the cave and continued through the valley, Anahi's mind wandered again to the future.
How long could they keep running? How long would they have to live this way?
She didn't have the answers, but for the first time since they had started their journey, she felt a flicker of hope. No matter how difficult things became, no matter how many times they were forced to flee, they had each other, and that was enough for now. They continued on, the weight of the world still heavy on their shoulders, but with each step forward, Anahi knew they were fighting for something.
Maybe they couldn't change the past, but they could still fight for the future, together.
The journey had been long and tiring, and Anahi felt the weight of each step. Every day the world around her seemed to grow more distant, and the pain of leaving her home, her family, and everything she had known began to settle deep in her chest. But there was something in her now, something she had never felt before. Hope. It was fragile, delicate, like a thread she had to hold on to with all her might. And it was tied to Jared, the man who had stood by her through the worst of it. They had spent weeks together, traveling through barren deserts, rocky canyons, and rugged hills, and despite the fear that always seemed to lurk just behind them, something had changed. The bond between Anahi and Jared had become more than just a shared struggle. It had become a partnership, something neither of them had expected when they first met in the desert. Jared had never been one to talk about his past, but Anahi had slowly come to understand him. The loss he had experienced, the quiet pain he carried, was not so different from her own. And in his silence, in his steady presence, she had found something she had never expected. Someone who understood. Someone who didn't need to say much to show that he cared. The days stretched on, and each one felt like a new challenge, a new test of endurance.
But there was a certain peace that had settled over Anahi.
The terror of being hunted was still there, still lurking in the background, but it no longer consumed her. She had Jared by her side, and together they had learned to navigate the uncertainty. They had learned to trust each other. One day, as they made their way through a dense forest at the base of a mountain range, Anahi felt a sense of relief. The thick trees and cool shade provided a welcome break from the open desert they had crossed. It was a small refuge, a place where they could catch their breath. But the danger was never far behind, and they both knew it. "I think we're safe for now," Jared said, his voice low as he glanced around the forest.
"But we can't stay here too long. We need to keep moving."
Anahi nodded, but a part of her wanted to rest, to finally let go of the constant tension that had gripped her for so long. They had been on the run for weeks now, and though they had managed to avoid the land grabbers, the fear of being caught had not faded. It was always in the back of her mind, a constant reminder that safety was fleeting. As they walked deeper into the forest, Anahi noticed how different it felt compared to the desert. The air was cooler, the ground softer beneath their feet. The forest seemed alive in a way the barren lands never had been. The trees towered above them, their branches thick with leaves, and the sound of birds calling in the distance gave the place a sense of peace. It was hard to believe that such beauty existed in a world that had been turned upside down by greed and destruction. But even in this peaceful place, Anahi knew the truth. They couldn't stay. As much as she longed for a break, they couldn't afford to let their guard down. They had to keep moving, keep finding new places to hide. The world they lived in no longer allowed for peace, for rest. It was a world of survival, and every day was a fight for tomorrow. Jared stopped and turned to her, his expression serious.
"We need to find shelter for the night, but tomorrow we move again."
She knew he was right. The journey ahead was still uncertain, and they couldn't afford to stop now. But as they set up camp beneath the shelter of a large oak tree, Anahi felt something shift in her. The weight of everything, the fear, the uncertainty, the loss, seemed a little lighter in that moment. She sat by the fire, the warmth of the flames pushing back the chill of the night air. Jared sat across from her, his eyes focused on the fire, lost in thought. For a while they sat in silence, the crackling of the fire the only sound between them. Anahi couldn't help but reflect on everything that had led them here. She had never imagined this life, this journey. She had never thought she would leave her home, that she would have to fight for survival in a world that no longer seemed familiar. But now, in this moment, she understood something important. Life had changed, but she was still here. She was still fighting, and Jared was fighting with her. She looked up at him, her voice soft but steady. "Thank you," she said, her words simple but full of meaning.
"For everything, for helping me."
"For not letting me do this alone." Jared looked up at her, his expression softening. He didn't speak right away, but when he did, his voice was gentle. "You don't have to thank me. We're in this together." Anahi smiled, the weight on her shoulders easing a little. For the first time since this journey began, she felt like she wasn't just surviving. She was living. But she was no longer just running. She was fighting for something worth holding on to. The night passed quietly, and as the first light of dawn broke through the trees, Anahi and Jared packed up their camp and began moving again. They didn't speak much, but there was an understanding between them now, a shared resolve. They didn't know where the road ahead would lead, but they knew they would face it together. As they traveled further into the forest, Anahi felt the heaviness of their journey begin to lift. They were no longer just running from the past. They were moving forward, toward something. Maybe it was hope. Maybe it was a chance for a new life. But whatever it was, Anahi knew she wasn't alone. Not anymore. Jared turned to her as they walked, a small, almost imperceptible smile on his face. "We'll get through this," he said, his voice full of quiet certainty. "Together!" Anahi didn't answer right away. She didn't need to. She knew that no matter what happened, she and Jared would keep going. They would keep fighting, keep moving forward. And one day they would find a place where they could finally stop running. a place where they could live without fear.
But for now, that future was still uncertain. They would face each day as it came, together, side by side.
And that for now was enough.